Hi everyone. In this video I'm going to give you all of the essential information you need to understand the development half of the development and health unit. In this lesson I'm going to talk to you about four key elements. What are indicators of development? What do they tell us? Why are they can't be relied upon and why they are unreliable? And how we compare countries using them. So let's get started. First of all, what is a development indicator? Basically, as you can see in the table, it's a statistic that we use to determine the level of development that a country is at. In the table you can see various examples, and you can use these scores to compare the relative levels of development of different countries. For example, Norway has a higher life expectancy than the UK. The next big concept that we need to address is that development indicators fall into two broad categories: economic and social indicators. So let's take a look at the first of these categories now. There are in fact lots and lots of indicators out there, and you only need to be broadly aware of a few of them. So I'm going to take you through a kind of a list of some of the most important and influential economic indicators. An economic indicator is one that tells us about the economic power and strength of a country. So, where an indicator reports a lower score, you can normally, from that, tell that that country is less developed. Let's start off with GDP. It stands for Gross Domestic Product, and what that means is it measures all of the value of all of the goods and services sold within that country. Another way of saying that is GDP measures the value of everything a country produces within its own borders. This tells you about a country's level of natural resources. Maybe they have lots of something valuable to sell, like oil, or maybe they are very industrialized and they have lots of factories for producing high-value goods. The next one is the GNI. Sometimes you'll see it written as GNP, but that's a little bit outdated. This stands for Gross National Income. GNP stands for Gross National Product, and to avoid confusion, they can be considered as the same. And gross national income is a measurement of a country's wealth in much the same way as domestic product is, but it includes, gross national income includes not just domestic goods and services, but those that are made beyond the borders of the country as well, internationally. And so the gross national income tells you about a country's power, not just domestically, but also in foreign markets. It tells you how influential a country is in its international trade. And also you can talk about the economic security of a country in a slightly, on a bigger scale than you can with the GDP, because with the GDP, you're just talking about domestic product. The CPI, or Consumer Price Index, is actually the one that you'll hear in the news most often. And it's one of the most important indicators and the one that's used most by economists. What it does is it shows the average price of a basket of goods for a consumer. We are consumers, we buy things in the shops, and the Consumer Price Index gives us an idea of how much an average imaginary basket of goods would cost. This is then used as a measure of inflation. You'll be aware that the price of things in the shops can go up or can go down. And also your wages for the work that you do could go up or could go down. And what the CPI does is it works out whether the wages we earn are going up at the same speed that the price of goods in the shops are going up. And if they are, that's fine. If they're not, so if the prices and things in the shops are going up too quickly, then that's called inflation. The CPI is a really important way of understanding the economic security of a country, and people will use it to decide whether to invest in our economy. Housing starts. This is, as it sounds, the number of houses that are started in their construction process. This has strong links, of course, to employment because construction is a massive employer. So if you have lots of housing starts, you must have lots of employment. Also, though, if you've got lots of houses being built, it's because you've got lots of people to buy those houses. And in order for people to buy houses, they have to get loans from banks. And so if the housing starts number is high, then that tells you that the banks must be very confident and will lend money to the public. Also, if the housing starts are high, it means that government must be comfortable lending money to developers to kickstart the construction process. All in all, lots of houses being built is a good sign of a strong economy. The quit rate refers to the percentage of people who quit their job. That means voluntarily, by the way. We're not talking about people who are sacked or fired. These numbers are collected centrally and it gives us the quit rate. Basically, if you've got a very strong economy, if everything's doing well and people feel secure and everyone has plenty of money, then people are more likely to voluntarily leave their jobs. Perhaps they retire early, perhaps they decide to take a career break, perhaps they decide to step back from their role to start a different business. But you would only do these things if you were in a period where you felt secure and safe and therefore the economy was doing well. So the quit rate is actually a strong indicator of a healthy economy. Finally, the one you're most familiar with probably is the employment rate. This is the percentage of people who have a job, and it gives us a way to understand the strength of the economy. If you've got lots of people in employment, well, lots of people must have access to education. You must have a good level of qualified workers, and you must have a strong economy that's producing jobs. So these are economic indicators. They tell you about the economic strength of a country. It's really important, not just for the exam, but for your life to know what these terms are and to know how they're used. To balance that, we have social indicators. And in the image on the screen, you can see what social indicators our government looks like. And if you Google that for yourself, you'll find that there's a fascinating webpage that shows all the social indicators that the UK government measures. And social indicators are used to assess the quality of our lives. Not just the economic strength of the country or the money in our pockets, but the quality of our lives. How is our health? How is our education? How is our diet? We, in the exam, are not necessarily going to be looking at the UK, though. Instead, it's more likely you'll be looking at international comparisons between developing countries. So it's important that you're familiar with a broad range of development indicators. And here's the main ones to know. The percentage of people living in a city. In some countries, this is less, and in some countries, it is more. The more people you have living in a city, the more people are likely to be university educated. The more people are likely to be working in secondary and tertiary employment. Secondary employment is manufacturing, and tertiary employment is service industries. An easy way to understand this is primary employment is when you take something out of the ground. So for example, a farmer taking a potato out of the field, that is a primary sector employment. The person who works in the factory that turns that potato into chips, that's secondary employment. And that's because it's manufacturing the original raw material into a new product and therefore adding value to it, which means it can be sold for more money. Tertiary employment is the person who takes the chip from the factory and puts it on, deep fries it and puts it on a plate in a restaurant. Again, they have added value to that product so they can sell it for more money. And societies that are made up of secondary and tertiary employment tend to be more developed. Infant mortality is the number of babies that do not reach their first birthday. This, of course, tells us about a country's level of healthcare, sanitation, disease, and natal care. That is the care given to children before and just after their births, things like vaccination programs. The literacy rate is the number of people who can read and write, and of course that tells us whether a country has good education provision, whether there's funding to train teachers, whether there's equal access to education for females and males. The birth and death rate tell us about access to contraception. They tell us whether there may be war and conflict. It tells us whether birth rates are high, we need children as carers and workers. And finally, you might look at a population pyramid and look at the population structure. And if you've looked at the population unit already, this will be familiar to you. But the ratio of males to females, for example, on a population pyramid tells you much about that society. The ratio of elderly to young also tells us about that society. So on the screen you can see a range of social indicators. So far you have only needed to understand two key concepts. One, that a development indicator tells you something about the country that it relates to. And two, that they divide into social and economic indicators. Beyond that, you just have to have a broad awareness of what the different development indicators can say about a country. There is a third category of development indicator, and those are called combined indicators. One of the problems with using any of the indicators I've just described is that on their own, they don't really say very much. One of the simplest ways to understand this is that the GNI, for example, though it may give a very interesting statistic on the economic power of France, say, it doesn't really tell us anything about how that wealth, how that economic power is spread around France. Is it equally spread? Or is the economic power actually held within the cities and the countryside is much poorer? So we need to find ways of making our indicators more accurate. And one of the best ways of doing that is to combine indicators together and use them in combination. And that's called a combined indicator. There are two that you need to know. The PQLI, which uses the literacy rate, infant mortality, and life expectancy of a country to get a score on a 0 to 100 scale. And the Human Development Index. And it is made up of life expectancy, education, and income. Now, for that reason, the Human Development Index is actually more reliable than the PQLI because it combines social indicators of life expectancy and education with economic indicators of per person income. Okay, so now we're really starting to get to the nitty-gritty. What you'll be asked to do is to comment on why using one indicator on its own, maybe a social indicator, maybe an economic indicator, is not reliable, and why using combined indicators is more reliable. So here's what a question would look like. Explain why using only one development indicator, such as gross national income, you see there, you need to know some examples of economic indicators in order to be able to understand the question. Explain why they may fail to reflect accurately the true quality of life within a country. Well, let's have a look. First of all, most indicators are averages, which hide extremes within a country. For example, in Saudi Arabia, there's a very rich minority and a very large number of poor people. But when all of their incomes are added up and averaged out, because of the exceedingly rich minority, it actually makes it look like most people in Saudi Arabia are really quite well off, which is inaccurate. Development is not just about money. So if we're only using the GNI, then that gives us a false perspective. The GNI tells us nothing about the rates of literacy within a country. For example, again, if we look at Saudi Arabia once again, we learn nothing about their level of literacy and healthcare just by looking at their GNI. A composite indicator, such as the HDI, gives a much more rounded picture by combining the indicators. Notice for this concept, you're earning a mark. Also, you can double up this mark. It's quite a clever way to score marks quickly and easily to know that the HDI is better than the PQLI because it's made up of economic and social indicators. And of course, that gives you an even more accurate view. This one looks a little bit more technical, but if you refer back to the notes I've just covered, it's really not that difficult. The GDP is domestic, remember. That means at home. So it doesn't take account of foreign spending, whereas the GNI does. However, it's not possible to tell where a rise in GNI is being spent within a country. So the GNI, remember, is international, the GDP is domestic, and therefore the GDP doesn't give us that fuller picture, but just reporting that the GNI of a country is X amount of thousands of dollars, it doesn't actually tell us where that money is being made within that country. GNI is always expressed as dollars, by the way, and this allows for comparison. However, exchange rates between countries are always changing, so you have to be very careful about how you use it. Neither GDP nor GNI take into account the informal economy. What that means is people who make money and don't necessarily pay tax on it. So this is not necessarily called a black market, by the way. This is something called a grey market. People aren't acting necessarily illegally. It's more just that money is being made in ways that the government can't see or can't regulate. For example, in Nigeria, where they have enormous shanty towns, there's lots of business being done within those shanty towns. Millions of dollars of goods are exchanged every day as people buy their daily food or clothing or whatever. But the government has no means of tracking how much goods are being sold. And that is an example of a grey economy. And that cannot be counted within Nigeria's GDP or GNI. And so they are inaccurate. The CPI, the Consumer Price Index, allows us to understand inflation of the values of people's wages. Remember, it compares the cost of goods on the shelf to the amount of money that you make, and it checks to see if they're both growing at the same speed. However, different exchange rates between countries make it a difficult tool to compare one country to another, and for that reason it's not that useful. So why are indicators unreliable? These reasons here are a model answer that you should make sure that you've got a record of. The next question that we might be asked to answer is, suggest reasons for wide variations in development which exist between developing countries. So on the map, you can see on the screen a map of the world, and what's really important here is that you have some examples and you've got some case study knowledge. So you'll see I'm going to give you a whole bunch of these, and what I would recommend is that you just let me play through them really, and then you go back, pause the video and write down a selection of them. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you try and learn every single one of these, okay? So some countries, like Thailand, are actually they are developing countries, but they are slightly more developed than others because they have a unique feature. For example, Thailand has famously beautiful beaches and scenery, which creates a tourism industry. Other areas of the world, for example, China, have fairly lax laws regarding air pollution, and this means that industries are often attracted to invest there because they can save money on the kind of health and safety air pollution aspect. So they attract industries to their country. So there's two countries that are attracting foreign investment because of something unique in their country. You score the mark for being able to describe the case study. So for knowing about China and its lax air pollution laws, or for knowing about Thailand and its beautiful beaches, and then attaching that to the concept of manufacturing being attracted to the country, that's where you score the marks. Famine in, for example, Yemen can reduce people's capacity to work. Where countries suffer from conflict or civil war, they're unable to keep economy working. Now, a good example of that is the sad example of Syria. And the reason for that is often the country feels it has to spend money it would otherwise be spending on schools and housing, on medicine and weapons. Many countries suffer natural disasters. Haiti is a fantastic example of this, or maybe I should say a terrible example of this. The country was wiped out or very badly damaged and destroyed by an earthquake. And in 2011, I think, and that can set back their development by years, as they are still to this day having to repair that damage. Some countries, such as Saudi Arabia, have natural resources such as oil. And they're lucky. They can sell that to generate foreign currency. Good for them. Other countries have other advantages, though. Any country that is on the Straits of Malacca, which is this body of water here, have the advantage of being on an international shipping line, or shipping lane, I should say. And this means that anybody who has a port accessing this area of water can provide anchorage and refueling for international shipping. And that is, of course, to the advantage of a country that can do that. Some countries are famously corrupt. For example, Zimbabwe has a very famously corrupt economy, and that means that some money which should be going into schooling or to developing healthcare is being siphoned off into, for example, the military. Countries like Egypt benefit from their location being next to the Suez Canal. My history's a bit hazy, but I think Egypt got control over the Suez Canal in 1965, and that they benefit economically from this, from the ability of shipping. Instead of having to go all the way around Africa, shipping can actually shortcut and cut through a canal here and gain access to the Indian Ocean that way. Not surprisingly, Egypt will make you pay for the pleasure of using the canal. Some countries are much less lucky, though. For example, Mali is landlocked. It's got no access to the sea at all, and therefore it struggles to export and import goods. Just to the south, the country Burkina Faso is incredibly hot and dry, and this causes its soils to turn to desert, and that makes it very difficult to feed their population. Countries with poor education systems are likely to have low-skilled workers, and that makes it very difficult to attract any foreign companies to build a factory in your country. And many countries, such as Mali, have had to accumulate very large debts as they borrow money off richer countries to pay for building basic services, and that causes them to get into a debt cycle they can't escape. Okay. You want to replay that whole section, guys, and take notes, obviously, as usual. If you see it highlighted with a yellow background, it's notes definitely to be copied down. Bear in mind, though, two things. In this question, we're comparing developing countries. So all of my case studies are developing countries, and you try and learn a selection of them. Okay, you don't necessarily need to learn every single label that came up on the screen. Now there is, I still teach this, and I know some teachers watching this lesson will disagree with me doing that, but I still teach this. It is possible, I think, that you could get a question that asks you to look at a table where you are comparing countries. You can see Venezuela, Nigeria, and Malawi, and they've got three indicators. The three indicators that make up the HDI, in fact. And you're asked to explain the variations in development, just as we've done in the previous question, but instead you're asked to do it between the countries on the table. Now that's a different skill, because you don't necessarily know anything about Venezuela, Nigeria, and Malawi. So here's how to structure this answer. Look at the GNI. Who's got the highest GNI? Well, Venezuela clearly does. So it must be an industrialized society. It must have education and training. It must have natural resources that it can sell. It must have a good employment rate. Its CPI must be high. And if you think about it, you could go back to the notes on the economic indicators and you could pull out a whole load of stuff to talk about when you're talking about a country with a good GNI. For example, the quits rate must be high. They've got a really good GNI, they'll have a higher quits rate. The literacy rate. Obviously, this is the number of people who can read, and if it's high, as in Venezuela, then you're going to have funding for training of teachers, the construction of schools. The status of females accessing education must be good, and therefore there must be employment opportunities in secondary and tertiary industries. Life expectancy, again, Venezuela is the highest. So you could suggest that Venezuela must be safe and have a lack of conflict. It must have well-funded or better funding for its healthcare. We're not saying Venezuela is the same standard as Norway, but we're saying that it's better than Nigeria and Malawi. And the reasons for that must be that it must have better funding for its healthcare with higher doctors per person. Maybe there's better education, meaning people can spot and act on the symptoms of disease earlier. So you can see through this question why the notes in the earlier part of this lesson, where I'm talking about the social indicators and the economic indicators, those are important. You do want to have those written down. You do want to spend some time familiarizing yourself with what those different development indicators mean for a country. Okay, I hope that was helpful. The development part of the course is one that's worth spending some time on. You probably want to re-watch this video a few times. I have deliberately tried to keep this quite short and snappy because the concepts of development are to do with economics. They are to do with government policies like the GNI and the GDP, and that is a foreign language for some people. So I understand if some of these terms are a little complex for you, but that's why you need to watch this lesson a few times. That's why you need to take the notes and you want to spend some time reading them through. Okay? And remember, we're being asked to compare, we're being asked to say, what do indicators tell us about countries? We're being asked to say why indicators are unreliable. Okay? Why are they unreliable? And what are the reasons for the differences in development between countries? Okay, that's what it all boils down to. Why are indicators reliable or unreliable? And what are the reasons for the differences in development between countries? So the things to really focus on in this lesson are the part of the lesson where I've talked about reasons why indicators are unreliable. There's a model answer there. And secondly, the world map. The world map that has all of the reasons why different countries are at different levels of development. If you really want to boil it down to its basics, spend time on those two parts. Okay, good luck.